Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take the sources you provide, articles, research, maybe even your own notes, and really just immerse ourselves to pull out the key insights, the stuff you really need to know.
Yeah, think of it as us doing the heavy lifting so you get straight to the core of the topic, fully informed.
Exactly. And today, we are diving deep into something, well, pretty fundamental for navigating our world. Manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
We got quite a stack of sources for this one. Everything from psychological research on personality traits to articles about toxic relationships, workplaces.
Right, and even real-world scams, insights from self-defense thinking. It's a broad look.
It really is. So our mission today is pretty clear, right?
Yeah, we want to unpack what manipulation really is, help you get better at spotting those red flags.
Understand the why behind it.
The motivations, the psychology, definitely, and crucially, give you some practical ways to respond, to protect yourself.
Because the sources really hammer this home manipulation isn't always some shadowy figure. It could be, well, everywhere.
And often, quite unsettlingly, it comes from people we're close to, people in our circle of trust.
Which makes understanding it and knowing how to deal with it so incredibly important for, your well-being, your relationships.
Absolutely.
So let's start right at the beginning. What is manipulation? How's it different from just, trying to persuade someone, which we all do?
That distinction is, yeah, absolutely critical. It's where the sources really start. I mean, both involve trying to affect someone else's behavior, right?
Sure.
But the key difference, it boils down to two things: intent and transparency.
Intent and transparency. Okay, break that down for us.
Okay, so with healthy influence, the intent is usually constructive or, mutually beneficial. The idea is maybe to guide you towards something that's actually in your best interest, or maybe achieve a shared goal everyone knows about.
Like a mentor giving advice, maybe?
Exactly. Or a leader genuinely trying to inspire the team. And the methods are typically open, direct, ethical, using logic, sharing information, inspiration, persuasion based on shared value. The outcome they're hoping for is often win-win. Or at least, nobody gets harmed in the process. Healthy influence respects your autonomy.
Okay, so it respects you, respects your well-being. Makes sense.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with manipulation. Here, the intent is almost always self-serving.
Yeah.
The manipulator wants to push their own agenda, get what they want, gain something for themselves, often at a cost to you, even if that cost isn't obvious up front.
So it's fundamentally selfish.
It is, by disposition, really. They're self-serving, and the outcome is usually win-lose. They win, you lose because you've been exploited or pressured or harmed somehow.
So inherently exploitative, then?
Yes, and the methods show that. Manipulation leans heavily on covert tactics, indirect stuff, deception.
Sneaky.
Very. Instead of open discussion, it's pressure, maybe emotional blackmail, exploiting your weak spots. It often pushes you into doing things that actually go against your gut feeling, your values, maybe even just what's practical for you.
Things you wouldn't choose if you, knew the whole story or felt free to say no.
Exactly. Actions that are inconvenient or harmful or just not what you really want.
Okay, so influence is open, aims for mutual good. Manipulation is hidden, self-serving, exploitative, and I guess the results of manipulation must be kind of shaky.
Totally shaky, because it's built on lies, deception. It only works as long as the truth is hidden. Once the manipulator's real motives or tactics come out, the whole thing can just poof, fall apart. Trust is destroyed.
Right.
Healthy influence, being built on honesty, tends to create much more lasting, positive results. So that's the line. Ethical, overt, respectful versus unethical, covert, exploitative.
That's a really clear distinction from the sources. Okay, so if it's driven by self-interest, what else fuels this kind of behavior? What are manipulators really after?
The sources dig into these core motivations, and they point to a few things that are often tangled together. First, as we said, just overwhelming self-interest. It's their default setting, prioritizing themselves.
Not just a one-time thing, but how they operate.
Exactly. Then, tied very closely to that, is this deep craving for power.
Power.
Yeah, a real need to feel dominant, superior, in control in their interactions. Getting you to comply isn't just about getting what they want. Sometimes the compliance itself is the win. It proves to them they have power over you.
So controlling you is the point, almost as much as the outcome.
Absolutely. Which leads to the third thing. this pervasive need for control, which can actually stem from their own internal issues.
How so?
Well, some manipulators might feel a lack of control in their own lives, or they see emotions, theirs or yours, as messy, weak things they need to manage. So this internal feeling of maybe chaos or inadequacy gets projected outwards. It comes out as this relentless need to be right all the time and to make you wrong.
Wow.
By controlling the conversation, the decisions, how you feel. It gives them a temporary feeling of order, maybe, power over their own internal stuff.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about getting stuff, but maybe managing their own insecurity or fear.
Exactly. The sources suggest these things, the self-serving nature, the power craving, and this internal need for control manifesting as needing to be right are really the engine behind the tactics we see.
And those tactics. Wow, they can be incredibly varied and often hit right where it hurts most, exploiting trust. Right. The sources talk about exploiting intimacy.
Yeah, and this is probably one of the most painful ways manipulation happens, because it takes the very closeness that should feel safe.
And turns it against you.
Precisely. They use what they know about you because you trusted them. Your vulnerabilities, your past hurts, your hopes, your fears. They weaponize that intimate knowledge.
Ugh. Like using something you confided in them to guilt trip you later.
Exactly that. Or bringing up a past mistake to undermine you now. Referencing shared dreams to pressure you. It's a sad truth highlighted in the sources that this often comes from people really close, family, partners, friends, even colleagues we trust, because they know us best.
They know exactly where to push the buttons.
They do. We lower our defenses with them naturally, and that's what gets exploited.
It makes the betrayal feel so much worse. The sources mention an extreme case that really illustrates this. Dee Dee Blanchard and Gypsy Rose.
Yeah, that case is, it's exceptionally disturbing, but it's a stark, real-world example of exploiting intimacy to a horrifying degree. Dee Dee Blanchard had Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Where the caregiver fakes or causes illness in someone they care for.
Right, usually for attention or sympathy. In Gypsy's case, Dee Dee fabricated this whole narrative of severe chronic illnesses, leukemia, muscular dystrophy, needing a wheelchair, feeding tubes, all of it, completely invented.
So years, right?
Years. She forced Gypsy into unnecessary surgeries, medications, all built on this foundation of a mother's love and care, the ultimate intimate bond.
Controlling her whole life based on lies.
Total control. Dee Dee used the devoted mother role to gain sympathy, attention, donations,
Right.
while isolating Gypsy, limiting her education, her contact with the outside world. Gypsy's entire reality was shaped by these lies because she trusted her mom completely.
It's hard to even fathom.
It is. But it shows, in the most extreme way, how that intimate knowledge, a parent knowing everything, can be twisted to manipulate, to create a false world, to utterly dominate someone. It's the ultimate betrayal of trust weaponized.
A chilling example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving to other tactics that play on emotions.
Yeah.
Guilt tripping. We hear that term a lot.
Oh yeah, classic manipulation 101. Guilt tripping is basically using guilt or a sense of obligation to pressure you into doing something you don't really want to do.
Like, after all I've done for you, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Or, I guess my feelings don't matter then. Or just sighing dramatically and looking wounded until you cave.
It feels like they're dumping their feelings onto you, making it your problem.
That's precisely the goal. Make you feel responsible for their unhappiness or guilty about setting a perfectly reasonable boundary. And guilt. It's uncomfortable. We want it to go away.
So you do what they want to stop feeling guilty.
Right. You comply to alleviate the feeling they manufactured. It's a cycle. And it's really important to separate this from genuine guilt, when you've actually messed up.
Right, that's healthy.
Manipulative guilt is strategic. It's used regularly to control you. The sources connect it to emotional blackmail using what they call FOG.
POG.
Fear, obligation, and guilt. Those are the levers manipulators pull. Making you afraid of consequences, reminding you of your obligations, laying on the guilt.
Fear, obligation, guilt. Wow, that really frames it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so shifting from guilt, which can feel sort of passive sometimes, to more active stuff. How about anger? How is anger used manipulatively?
Wielding anger is another really powerful, often scary tactic. And this isn't just, someone losing their temper. It's anger used strategically.
How so?
It could be yelling, maybe threatening gestures, cruel words, or just being totally unpredictable and explosive. The aim is always to control your reaction, your behavior.
Using intimidation to dominate things.
Exactly. One big reason is just to shut you down. If you try to bring up a problem or ask a tough question and they just erupt, most people will back off immediately to avoid the conflict.
Nobody wants to be yelled at.
Right. So mission accomplished for the manipulator. They avoid accountability, shut down the conversation they didn't want to have.
It's a deflection shield.
Definitely. Anger can also be used to project false moral outrage.
What do you mean?
Like, imagine you confront someone about cheating, maybe you even have proof. They might react with extreme, over-the-top anger, outrage. How dare you accuse me?
To make you feel bad for asking.
Exactly. It flips the script. Suddenly, you're the bad guy for even suspecting them. It makes you doubt yourself. Back off.
Wow, that's clever in a really awful way.
It's very effective. And sometimes, honestly, wielding anger is just about feeling powerful, superior. Think of a boss who yells to keep people in line, or an abusive partner using anger to control. It forces compliance through fear, reinforces their sense of dominance.
Using raw emotion as a weapon, okay? What about bringing other people into it? The sources mention triangulate.
Triangulation. Yeah, this one's a bit more complex. It's basically when a manipulator avoids talking directly to the person they have an issue with, and instead brings a third person into the mix.
So instead of A talking to B, A talks to C about B, or uses C to get to B.
Exactly. They might communicate through the third person, or complain about the target to the third person, or use that third person to apply pressure. A key sign is often that the two people being triangulated, B and C in your example, barely talk directly about the issue. Everything gets filtered through the manipulator A.
And how is that manipulative? What's the gain?
It serves a few purposes. It can be used to divide and conquer, pit two people against each other.
Oh.
Maybe a parent constantly tells sibling B how much better sibling A is, while privately telling sibling A how special they are compared to B. It breeds resentment, stops them teaming up.
Prevents them comparing notes about the parent.
Right. Or a manager might relay criticisms between two team members, creating friction instead of just facilitating a direct conversation. It keeps the manipulator in control of the narrative.
And avoids direct confrontation for them.
Yes. It can also be used to apply pressure indirectly. If I want you to do something, instead of asking you directly, I might complain to our mutual friend about how unhelpful you're being, knowing they'll likely talk to you and pressure you.
So they get someone else to do their dirty work.
Pretty much. And it lets the manipulator play the victim or the concerned friend to the third party, gaining sympathy. It just creates confusion, breeds mistrust, and stops healthy, direct problem solving, all while keeping the manipulator pulling the strings.
These tactics, they often seem linked to certain ways of thinking, certain personality patterns. The sources get into the darker side of psychology here.
They do. They introduce this concept called the dark triad.
The dark triad. Okay, sounds pretty intense.
It refers to three specific personality traits that often overlap or appear together: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. What's the common thread?
Well, while they're distinct, people scoring high on these tend to share things like a lack of empathy, maybe interpersonal hostility, a tendency to be offensive or antagonistic towards others. Basically, a predisposition towards exploiting or manipulating people for their own gain.
And is it like you either have these traits or you don't? Black and white.
No, not usually. The sources stress these are typically seen as spectrums. You can score higher or lower. Someone might have, say, narcissistic traits without having full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, but those traits still drive manipulative behavior.
Okay.
And interestingly, some people high in these traits, maybe particularly Machiavellianism or subclinical psychopathy, can actually seem quite successful, at least for a while.
Really? How?
Well, their traits might look like charisma or decisiveness or ambition in certain contexts like business, but that success is often built on exploiting others, and it tends not to last once people see behind the mask.
Right, the mask slips eventually. Let's unpack each one. Narcissism first.
Sure, so general narcissism, think inflated sense of self-importance, feeling superior, needing tons of admiration, but having very little empathy. They often promote themselves constantly, feel entitled to special treatment, and don't really reciprocate. They're takers.
And the sources mention different types?
Yeah, they distinguish between the overt or grandiose type. That's the classic image, right?
Yeah.
Arrogant, assertive, obviously thinks they're amazing. But then there's covert or vulnerable narcissism.
Covert narcissism. Sounds harder to spot.
It often is. It's more passive-aggressive. They still have that inflated sense of importance and disregard for others, but it comes out differently. They might seem shy or hypersensitive, maybe play the victim a lot.
So they don't seem arrogant on the surface.
Right. They might even seem to have low self-esteem, but underneath that entitlement and feeling of superiority is still there. Their manipulation is subtler, passive aggression, guilt tripping, quiet shaming, while maybe seeming fragile or sensitive themselves.
Wow. So the quiet, sensitive colleague could actually be.
Potentially, yes. The sources give workplace examples. Being really condescending in private, but super charming publicly, making unreasonable demands framed as needing help, subtly blaming others for their errors, spreading gossip masked as concern.
That sounds exhausting to deal with.
It is, and a key thing with narcissists, especially covert ones, is how they handle blame. They are often terrified of shame, of facing their own flaws, so they externalize blame compulsively.
It's always someone else's fault.
Always. And they need you to buy into their version of reality, where they're the victim or the hero. If you try to defend yourself or point out their part in a problem, that's seen as a massive betrayal, disloyalty. It can trigger intense rage because you're threatening that fragile self-image they've built.
That's a really powerful defense mechanism driving the manipulation.
Mm.
Okay, what about the second one? Machiavellianism.
Machiavellianism, yeah, named after the philosopher Machiavelli, is all about a strategic, cynical, often amoral approach to life and relationships. People high in this are focused on gaining power, status, control, mostly through cunning and manipulation.
So it's very calculated, using people like chess pieces.
That's a good way to put it. They see relationships as transactional, people as tools. They're described as shrewd social strategists, good at reading situations, figuring out motivations, and then exploiting that for their own benefit. Flattery, deceit, charm, they're all just tools in the toolbox.
And they think everyone else is like that too.
Often, yeah. They tend to have cynical views of human nature, believing most people are self-interested and easily manipulated, and that kind of justifies their own behavior in their minds.
If everyone's doing it, why shouldn't I?
Something like that. The sources also mention a link between high Machiavellianism and being extroverted, predicting more manipulation. If you're outgoing and socially skilled and also cynical and strategic, well, you've got the means and the motive.
A potent combination indeed. Okay, the last one, psychopathy. And the sources seem to really focus on this idea of the corporate psychopath.
Right. So psychopathy in this context usually means subclinical traits. We're not necessarily talking about violent criminals here, but people who display traits like superficial charm, manipulativeness, a profound lack of empathy, impulsivity, maybe disregard for rules.
And how does that play out at work or in leadership?
Well, initially their style might seem charismatic or bold, but the sources suggest it's often more like packaged coercion dominance hidden under a veneer. Their lack of empathy might look like being cool under pressure, ignoring rules, might look like being innovative.
So the very things that make them dangerous can look like strengths in a corporate setting.
Exactly. And that's the core of the corporate psychopath idea. These are folks drawn to leadership roles, especially in high-stakes, profit-driven environments. They seem to excel at climbing the ladder by exploiting others and the system, all without remorse or empathy. They're subclinical because they function, they present this convincing mask of normalcy, even charm.
Why are they drawn to power, and how do they get it?
The power itself, the control, the rewards, that's the draw. Their manipulation skills, their coolness, their risk-taking can make them seem like ideal leaders. They're often good at exaggerating achievements. There's usually a honeymoon period where everyone's impressed.
Before the mask slips.
Before the damage starts showing. The sources point to a core motivation being a raw desire for domination. They want to be on top, in charge.
And the damage can be huge, right?
Massive. Financial losses from recklessness or fraud, terrible dysfunction within the organization, talented people leaving in droves because the environment becomes toxic. One stat mentioned was that a significant chunk of workplace bullying comes from leaders with these traits.
Creates fear and mistrust.
Absolutely. And the systems aren't always great at stopping them.
How so?
Well, corporate law often deals with the aftermath, Penalties after bad decisions are made. It's harder to prevent individuals with these traits from getting power in the first place. Rules like the business judgment rule can protect decisions unless there's blatant fraud, making it tough to challenge toxic leadership based on personality before real harm is done. There aren't many built-in checks for these specific traits during hiring or promotion, especially in high levels.
That feels like a real blind spot in the system.
Yeah.
Okay, beyond these big personality patterns, another specific tactic mentioned is gaslighting. We hear that word a lot these days. What does it really mean?
Gaslighting is, it's a really insidious form of psychological manipulation. The whole point is to make someone doubt their own reality, their memory, their perception, even their sanity.
So it's not just disagreeing, it's actively making you feel crazy.
Exactly. Systematically undermining your sense of what's real. They might deny things that definitely happen. I never said that. Contradict themselves constantly. Question your memory. You always forget things. Dismiss your feelings. You're just being too sensitive. Or flat out lie about things you know are true.
Making you constantly second-guess yourself.
Yeah, totally. And it thrives on power imbalances, whether it's authority at work, dominance in a relationship, or even using societal biases.
Like gender stereotype.
Yeah, the sources mention that. For example, a woman expresses valid emotion in an argument, and her partner dismisses her as hysterical or overreacting, positioning himself as the calm, rational one. It subtly reinforces the idea that her emotional perception isn't reliable.
It creates this weird, disorienting feeling for the victim.
A feeling of surreality, the sources call it. You stop trusting your own judgment, become more dependent on the manipulator's version of events, which just gives them more control.
Awful.
And it gets even worse with collective gaslighting.
Collective, like a group doing it.
Yeah, it can happen in families, workplaces, friend groups, where the wider community somehow backs up the abuser's story. They might deny the abuse is happening, downplay the victim's experience, or even blame the victim.
So everyone around you is telling you you're wrong.
Exactly. Imagine trying to get support and people say, oh, they wouldn't do that, or are you sure you're not misinterpreting things? It makes the victim feel completely isolated and reinforces the manipulator's narrative that they are the problem. It's especially damaging when it happens in places that should be supportive. And the link is clear. Experiencing gaslighting leads to way more anxiety, way lower self-esteem. It's crushing.
Understanding all this is crucial.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, why do people put up with it? What makes someone vulnerable or keeps them stuck?
That's a really important question. The sources point to a few key factors. A big one is low self-esteem.
How does that play a role?
Well, manipulators often target people with low self-esteem because they tend to be more agreeable, more desperate for approval. They become people pleasers.
Easier to control because they want that validation.
Right. The manipulator wants the victim totally focused on their needs, constantly seeking their approval. And sometimes manipulators will actively try to destroy someone's self-esteem, constant criticism, belittling, undermining successes.
To make them feel dependent.
Exactly, and make them feel inadequate, like they couldn't possibly manage without the manipulator, or deserve better treatment. Low self-esteem makes it really hard to set and defend boundaries. You might not even feel like you have the right to say no.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? The manipulation lowers self-esteem, which makes you more vulnerable to manipulation.
Totally. Then there's fear. Fear is huge.
Fear of what?
Fear of confronting the manipulator. Maybe they'll get angry, retaliate. Fear of leaving the situation, being alone. Financial worries. Just the fear of the unknown.
The devil you know.
Sometimes feels safer, yeah. And this fear gets much worse if there's a lack of social support.
No one to turn to.
Right. If you don't have trusted friends, family, colleagues, that feeling of being trapped is intense, and manipulators often work hard to isolate their victims for exactly this reason, cut off their support network.
Makes leaving seem impossible. And does your past, like your upbringing, play into it?
Absolutely. A history of trauma or growing up in a home where your feelings or needs were constantly ignored or invalidated,
Yeah.
that can set you up for this.
Yeah.
You might learn that people-pleasing is how you stay safe or get any kind of acceptance. So manipulative behavior might feel almost normal in adulthood because it's familiar, even though it's damaging. Your internal radar for healthy treatment might be off.
Okay, so understanding why someone might tolerate it is one thing, but the crucial part is recognizing it and figuring out how to respond, how to protect yourself. Where do you start with identifying the signs?
The first thing, honestly, trust your gut. That little voice, that nagging feeling that something's just not right about someone or a situation. The sources really emphasize listening to that intuition. Don't brush it off just because you can't immediately pin down why you feel weird.
Pay attention to that internal alarm.
Definitely. Also, look for those inconsistencies we talked about, especially with potential covert narcissists. Is their public image totally different from how they treat you or others privately? That gap is a huge red flag.
The mask versus the reality.
Exactly. And watch how they react if you try to bring others into the loop.
Oh, yeah.
If someone desperately tries to keep you isolated, discourage you from talking to your boss or a therapist or even just a trusted friend, that's a massive warning sign. Manipulators want to control the narrative, control you. Discouraging outside input is a classic move. The sources call it a strong detector of manipulators.
Keep it just between us.
Yeah, that sounds suspicious. Very. Also, just step back and look at their overall pattern. How comfortable are they with lying? Little lies, big lies. Do they seem remorseful? And are they fundamentally givers or takers in the relationship? Manipulators are almost always takers, taking your time, energy, validation, whatever, without giving much back, genuinely.
Assessing that balance.
Yeah. In relationships, these are the red flags that scream toxic situation.
Mhm.
In the workplace, look for patterns. Belittling, bullying, harassment, insane work hours, leaders with zero empathy, discrimination, high turnover, just a general vibe of mistrust. These signal manipulation and dysfunction.
Okay, so you spot the flags. What's the next step? How do you start protecting yourself?
Setting healthy boundaries, it's absolutely foundational. Boundaries are basically the rules of engagement, what's okay with you, what's not.
Not too rigid, not too weak.
Exactly. Rigid boundaries push everyone away. Porous boundaries mean you can't say no, you overshare, people walk all over you. Healthy boundaries are in the middle. They let connection happen, but they protect your time, your energy, your emotional space.
And it sounds like manipulators are kind of using unhealthy boundaries to get their way.
That's a great way to put it. Their tactics are their twisted way of enforcing boundaries that only benefit them. So, to set healthy ones, you first need to get clear on what you actually need. Respect, privacy, honesty, the right to say no. Knowing your needs gives you something concrete to build your boundaries around.
Makes sense. But then, how do you communicate those boundaries, especially if you expect pushback?
Good question. Communication strategies are key. One big one is using I statements.
Instead of you statements.
Right. Instead of saying, you always make me feel guilty, try, I feel pressured when, or I feel hurt when. It frames it as your experience, which sounds less like an attack. It might make them less defensive. No guarantees with manipulator, but it's a better approach.
Stating your reality without blaming.
Exactly. Another approach, if you feel safe enough, is to actually name the manipulation. Calmly. Respectfully.
Whoa, call it out directly.
Sometimes, yes. First, acknowledge it to yourself. Recognize you're being manipulated. It's normal to feel upset or confused. That's the goal. Try to ground yourself first, maybe take some deep breaths. Then, using those I statements, be ready with specific examples. When I said I couldn't do X and you responded by saying Y, I felt manipulated because having concrete examples is crucial because they often rely on vagueness and denial.
Facts cut through the fog. But what if confronting them isn't safe or just doesn't work? Is that where the gray rock thing comes in?
Exactly. The gray rock method is more of a defensive tactic. It's often recommended when dealing with people high in narcissistic or psychopathic traits, people who feed on drama and emotional reactions.
So you become boring.
Pretty much, like a dull gray rock. You
Yeah.
minimize your reactions, keep conversations super factual, brief, don't share personal stuff, give very short, neutral answers.
Like, okay,
Yeah, or just stick to necessary info like the weather or logistics. The idea is to become so uninteresting, so unresponsive, that they lose interest in trying to manipulate you for emotional supply. You're not giving them the reaction they crave. It's a boundary created by being boring.
flying under the radar, kind of.
Exactly. It's about managing the interaction, not changing them. But one thing the sources are really clear on: don't try to use their tactics back on them.
Don't fight fire with fire. Why not?
Yes.
Seems tempting sometimes.
It is tempting, but the sources strongly advise against it. Manipulation relies on lies, deceit, coercion. Using those tactics yourself, even in self-defense, means crossing an ethical line. It makes you complicit.
It normalizes the bad behavior.
Right. And it makes it easier for you to cross that line again later. There's a big difference between ethical persuasion, standing up for yourself honestly, and unethical manipulation. Blurring that line compromises your own integrity.
That's a really important point to remember, even when you feel pushed. Okay, beyond specific tactics, how do you build more general resilience against manipulation?
Building emotional resilience is huge. That involves emotional literacy, knowing yourself, your own emotions, your triggers, your vulnerabilities, and also social intelligence, understanding others, empathy, which actually helps you spot manipulation because you get better at reading intentions or lack thereof.
So understanding yourself and others better emotionally.
Yes. Being able to manage your own reactions when someone tries to push your buttons is key. Also, cultivating what the sources call flexible optimism.
Flexible optimism.
Yeah, having a positive outlook, but one that's grounded in reality. Not so naive you miss red flags, but not so cynical you see manipulation everywhere. Also, developing good problem-solving skills, facing challenges instead of avoiding them, makes you stronger. And regular self-reflection helps you check your perceptions, process things.
Be grounded. And social support, we mentioned that earlier, crucial for resilience.
Absolutely critical. Having that network people you trust, who validate you, give you perspective, is maybe one of the biggest protectors against manipulation, especially gaslighting and isolation.
Having people who have your back.
Exactly. The sources also briefly mention physical self-defense training.
Really? How does that connect?
The idea is that learning to protect yourself physically, even simple techniques focused on surprise, can build a sense of personal power and agency. That feeling of capability can actually translate into feeling more empowered in verbal or emotional confrontations, too. It's another layer of feeling prepared.
Interesting connection. Now, for people who've been through really toxic, manipulative situations long term, is professional help usually needed?
Very often, yes. The sources stress this. Getting out from under chronic manipulation or emotional abuse leaves scars. It messes with your self-esteem, your anxiety levels, your whole sense of reality. Talking to a mental health professional, a therapist, counselor, someone specializing in trauma or toxic relationships is often vital for healing.
What can therapy do?
Help you process what happened, rebuild your identity and self-worth, learn to trust yourself again, establish healthy boundaries going forward, develop coping strategies. It provides crucial support. And in work situations, besides personal support, knowing how to formally document the manipulation or harassment is also really important if you need to take action or protect yourself. Documentation is evidence against their distortions.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from what manipulation even is, the dark motivations behind it, the sneaky tactics, all the way to how to spot it and respond.
Yeah.
It's clear manipulation leaves real scars, hurts mental health, damages self-worth, creates toxic environments.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that emotional abuse manipulation, it's not something anyone just has to accept or tolerate. The path forward that the sources outline really involves acknowledging it, using these strategies, setting boundaries, communicating assertively, and then the hard work of rebuilding yourself.
Reclaiming your autonomy, right? And building healthier ways of relating. It sounds like developing that resilience, building the support network, committing to your own growth.
Yeah,
Those are the long-term investments.
definitely. Not just for recovery, but for preventing future harm, too. Building relationships on respect and transparency, not control and hidden agendas.
Yeah. This deep dive really highlights how damaging manipulation can be, how it comes from those needs for power, maybe those dark triad traits, and how it exploits our vulnerabilities, low self-esteem, lack of support. We've seen the tactics, talked about protection, and it's sobering to think how these traits are on a spectrum, often hidden, and how even our systems sometimes fail to protect against them when they gain power. Which really leads to a final thought, doesn't it? Given that manipulation preys on vulnerability and can slip through systemic cracks, how can we, as individuals and as part of society, do more than just protect ourselves? How do we actually foster a culture where critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and genuine empathy make everyone more resilient? How do we build environments where transparency and mutual respect are just the norm?
That's a big, important question to ponder. How do we make manipulation harder to succeed?
Definitely something to reflect on. We've unpacked a lot today. What really stood out most to you from all these sources?
For me, I think it's just how effectively manipulation exploits trust, especially from people we should be able to trust. It hammers home how vital it is to listen to your intuition, even when it's uncomfortable or confusing. Don't ignore that gut feeling.
Yeah, I agree. Learning to trust yourself seems key. Well, thank you for providing such comprehensive sources for this deep dive. It's given us, and hopefully you listening, some incredibly valuable insights.
It felt like a really important topic to explore.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We hope this leaves you feeling more informed, more empowered, and maybe a bit more equipped to navigate the complexities of human interaction with greater clarity and resilience.